For Arthur Phelps, the dead were far more predictable and less trouble than the living. For 20 years, he had been the head mortician and manager of Serenity Meadows Funeral Home, a family-owned business that prided itself on dignity and respect. Arthur was a master of his craft, able to restore a face ravaged by tragedy into a peaceful visage ready for its final viewing. He was trusted, respected, and utterly, completely bored. His boredom, coupled with a quiet resentment for the wealthy families who spent more on a casket than he made in a month, birthed a secret sideline. He called it posthumous reallocation. Everyone else would call it theft. It started small. A simple gold wedding band on a man whose wife had passed years earlier. Who would miss it? Then it was a necklace on an elderly woman with no immediate family. The thrill was addictive, and the risk felt minuscule. The dead tell no tales, and the living never double-checked. He developed a system. He'd use a pair of locking forceps to gently remove rings without leaving a mark. He'd snip necklaces with surgical scissors and superglue the clasp back together so it appeared broken. He only took items that could be easily melted down or sold to a discreet pawn shop 2 towns over. For 3 years, his scheme funded a lifestyle his modest salary could not. A new boat, a vintage watch collection, weekend trips to casinos. He grew arrogant, convinced of his own infallibility. His downfall began with Mrs. Edna Hofstadter. Edna was a wealthy, devoutly Catholic widow. Per her strict instructions, she was buried with the simple silver locket that contained a faded photo of her husband on one side and her infant son on the other. It was worthless to Arthur's pawn guy, sentimental value only, so he left it alone. He performed his duties with his usual somber grace, and she was interred in the family mausoleum. A month later, her daughter Maria burst into the funeral home, her face streaked with tears. "We need to exhume my mother," she blurted out to a stunned Arthur. "Exhume, my dear? That is a traumatic and expensive process. May I ask why?" Arthur asked, his voice a practiced, soothing balm. "It's a matter of faith," Maria explained, trying to compose herself. "Our priest realized she was buried in a non-consecrated vault. My mother would be devastated to know she wasn't resting on holy ground. We have to move her to the consecrated section of the mausoleum. The bishop has approved it." Arthur's blood ran cold. An exhumation. It was his worst nightmare, but one he had always considered a remote, theoretical risk. He had to protest. "The process is very hard on the family. We've already arranged it with the diocese and the state," Maria said firmly. "It's happening tomorrow morning." The next day was overcast, a dull gray sky pressing down on the cemetery. Arthur stood by, wearing his most professional mask of solemnity, as workers unsealed the marble front of the Hofstadter mausoleum. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He tried to reassure himself. He hadn't taken anything from her. The locket was there. It would be fine. The pallbearers slid the casket out and onto a trolley. The family and the priest gathered around as the funeral director, under the watchful eye of a state official, prepared to open the casket. This was the final step, a visual confirmation of identity before reconsecration and reinterment. The seal broke with a soft hiss. Arthur's palms were slick with sweat inside his gloves. The lid was lifted. There lay Edna Hofstadter, perfectly preserved, her hands folded over her chest. And there, around her neck, was the silver locket. Arthur let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. It was okay. He was safe. It was Maria who noticed it first. A small, sharp gasp escaped her lips. "Her hands ... double quotes," she whispered, pointing a trembling finger. Everyone leaned in. Arthur's eyes followed her gaze. Edna's hands were folded, but on her left ring finger, next to her simple gold wedding band, was a stark white line of skin, a band of flesh noticeably paler than the rest. "My mother never took off her mother's ring," Maria said, her voice hardening from grief to confusion. "The emerald with the diamond flank. She called it her earthly connection. She made us promise she would be buried with it. Where is it?" Arthur's world tilted. He remembered that ring. A stunning, large emerald. He had taken it, reasoning that with her hands folded, no one would ever see the pale skin beneath. The locket was the obvious sentimental piece. The ring was his secret prize. He had melted it down the very day she was buried. A dreadful silence fell over the group. The state official's expression shifted from bureaucratic boredom to sharp attention. The priest looked on, horrified. I can assure you she was dressed and prepared according to the family's precise instructions, Arthur stammered, his voice losing its practiced calm. Perhaps it was misplaced at the hospital? My mother died at home, Maria said, her eyes narrowing, fixing on Arthur with a terrifying intensity. We dressed her ourselves. That ring was on her finger when we left her in your care. The state official stepped forward, pulling out his phone. I think we need to have a conversation with the police, Mr. Phelps. The investigation was swift and brutal. A warrant was issued for Arthur's home. In his garage, they found the small forge he used to melt the metal. In his safe, they found piles of gold and silver bars, along with a ledger detailing his sales. Most damning of all, they found a single small diamond he had kept aside from Mrs. Hofstadter's ring, too beautiful to melt, a keepsake of his greatest score. The newspaper headlines were merciless. Ghoul of Serenity Meadows, the grave robber mortician. At his sentencing, Maria Hofstadter gave a victim impact statement. She didn't speak of the ring's monetary value. She spoke of the violation, the theft of a final promise, the desecration of her mother's peace for something as cheap as greed. Arthur Phelps, the man who had spent his life preparing the dead for their final rest, was sentenced to 15 years in prison. He often wondered if his cellmate, a burly man named Vince, who was in for armed robbery, would have ever thought to steal from the dead. The living, Arthur had learned far too late, were much more dangerous, and they always eventually demanded an accounting.